Good evening. It is 2 minutes past 6 p.m. I'm going to be sharing Butler's The Lives of the Saints. Today is the 30th of August 2023. So, Saint Rose of Lima, a virgin, I'm going to begin with her story. And that is why my granddaughter, by my son, is called Rose. So, and I hope one day she'll hear this maybe. There are other saints on this. I've written them up. The Saint Rose of Lima, Saints Felix and ADAUCTUS, martyr, Saint PAMMACHIUS, AD 410, Saint RUMON or RUAN, 6th century, Saint FANTINUS, abbot, 10th century, and Blessed Bronislava, Virgin, AD 1259. Saint Rose of Lima, Virgin. Asia, Europe, and Africa had been watered with the blood of many martyrs and adorned for ages with the shining example of innumerable saints, whilst the vast regions of America lay barren till the faith of Christ began to enlighten them in the 16th century. And this maiden appeared in that land, like a rose amid thorns, the first fruits of its canonized saints. She was of Spanish extraction, born at Lima, the capital of Peru, in 1586. Her parents, Caspar de Flores and Maria del Oliva, being decent folk of moderate means. She was christened Isabel, but was commonly called Rose, and she was confirmed by Saint Toribio, Archbishop of Lima, in that name only. When she was grown up, she seems to have taken Saint Catherine of Siena for her model, in spite of the objections and ridicule of her parents and friends. One day, her mother, having put on her head a garland of flowers to show her off before some visitors, she stuck in it a pin so deeply that she could not take off the garland without some difficulty. Hearing others frequently commend her beauty, and fearing lest it should be an occasion of temptation to anyone, she used to rub her face with pepper in order to disfigure her skin with blotches. A woman happening one day to admire the fineness of the skin of her hands and her shapely fingers, she rubbed them with lime, and was unable to dress herself for a month in consequence. By these and other even more surprising austerities, she armed herself against external dangers. I hope my granddaughter doesn't do this, and against the insurgence of her own senses. But she knew that this would avail her little unless she banished from her heart self-love, which is the source of pride, and seeks itself even in fasting and prayer. Rose triumphed over this enemy by humility, obedience, and denial of her own will. She did not scruple to oppose her parents when she thought they were mistaken. but she never wilfully disobeyed them or departed from scrupulous obedience and patience under all trouble and contradictions, of which she experienced more than enough from those who did not understand her. Her parents, having been reduced to straitened circumstances by an unsuccessful mining venture, Rose, by working all day in the garden and late at night with her needle, relieved their necessities. These employments, these employments were agreeable to her, and she probably would never have entertained any thoughts of a different life if her parents had not tried to induce her to marry. She had a struggle with them over this for 10 years, and to strengthen herself in her resolution, she took a vow of virginity. Then, having joined the Third Order of St. Dominic, she chose for her dwelling a little hut in the garden, where she became practically a recluse. She wore upon her head a thin circlet of silver, studded on the inside with little sharp prickles, like a crown of thorns. So ardent was her love of God, that as often as she spoke of him, the tone of her voice and the fire which sparkled in her face showed the flame which consumed her soul. This appeared most openly when she was in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, and when in receiving it she united her heart to her beloved in that fountain of his love. God favoured St. Rose with many great graces, but she also suffered during 15 years' persecution from her friends and others, and even more severe trial of interior desolation and anguish in her soul. The devil also assaulted her with violent temptations, but the only help she got from those she consulted was the recommendation to eat and sleep more. At length she was examined by a commission of priests and physicians, who decided that her experiences, good and bad, were supernatural. But it is permissible to think that some of them, if correctly reported, were due to natural, physical, and psychological causes. The last 3 years of her life were spent under the roof of Don Gonzalo de Massa, a government official, and his wife, who was fond of Rose. In their house she was stricken by her last illness, and under long and painful sickness it was her prayer, Lord, increase my sufferings, and with them increase thy love in my heart. She died on August the 24th, 1617, 31 years old. The chapter, senate, and other honourable corporations of the city carried her body by turns to the grave. She was canonized by Pope Clement X in 1671, being the first canonized saint of the New World. The mode of life and ascetical practices of St. Rose of Lima are suitable only for those few whom God calls to them. The ordinary Christian may not seek to copy them, but must look to the universal spirit of heroic sanctity behind them. For all the saints, whether in the world, in the desert, or in the cloister, studied to live every moment to God. If we have a pure intention of always doing His will, we thus consecrate to Him all our time, even our meals, our rest, our conversation, and whatever else we do. All our works will thus be full. That's the end of the life story of the Rose of Lima. Now Saints Felix and ADAUCTUS, martyrs, AD 304, with a question by it. Saint Felix was a holy priest in Rome, no less happy in his life and virtue than in his name. Being apprehended in the beginning of Diocletian's persecution, he was put to the torture which he suffered with constancy, and was condemned to lose his head. As he was going to execution, he was met by a stranger, who, being a Christian, was so moved at the sight of the martyr and to the glory to which he was hastening, that he cried out aloud, "I confess the same law which this man professes. I confess the same Jesus Christ, and I will lay down my life in his cause." The magistrates, hearing this, caused him forthwith to be seized, and the martyrs were both beheaded together. The name of this stranger not being known, he was called by the Christians ADAUCTUS, i.e., the one added, because he was joined to Felix in martyrdom. The story, with sundry legendary embellishments, is derived from an inscription of Pope St. Damasus, which ran, "Oh, how truly and rightly named Felix! Happy you, who with faith untouched and despising the prince of this world, have confessed Christ and sought the heavenly kingdom. Know ye also, brethren, the truly precious faith by which ADAUCTUS too hastened, a victor to heaven. The priest Verus, at the command of his ruler Damasus, restored the tomb, adorning the thresholds of the saints. Saints Felix and ADAUCTUS were buried in the cemetery of Comidilla on the Ostian Way, where a church built over their tomb was uncovered in 1905. And there is a note, but I can't read it. The font is far too small for my eyes. The next saint is Saint PAMMACHIUS, AD 410. PAMMACHIUS was distinguished alike as a saint, a Roman citizen, a man of learning, and a friend of Saint Jerome, with whom he had studied in his youth and maintained correspondence all his life. He belonged to the house of the Furii and was a senator. In 385, he married Paulina, the second daughter of Saint Paula, that other great friend of Saint Jerome. PAMMACHIUS was probably one of the religious men who denounced Saint Pope Saint Cyriacus, a certain Jovinian, who maintained, among other errors, that all sins and their punishments are equal. He certainly sent copies of the heretic's writings to Jerome, who replied to them in a long treatise. This reply did not meet with the entire approval of Saint PAMMACHIUS. He found its language too strong, a failing to which Jerome was very inclined, and that it contained exaggerated praise of virginity and depreciation of marriage. So he wrote and told him so, and Saint Jerome replied in 2 letters, thanking him for his interest and defending what he had written. Jovinian was condemned in a synod at Rome and by St. Ambrose at Milan, and nothing more is heard of him. St. Jerome wrote a few years later that he had belched rather than breathed out his life amidst pheasants and pork. In 397, the wife of Saint PAMMACHIUS died, and in a letter of sympathy, Saint Paulinus of Nola wrote to him, "Your wife is now a pledge and an intercessory for you with Jesus Christ. She now obtains for you as many blessings in heaven as you have offered her treasure from hence, not honouring her memory with fruitless tears only, but making her a partner in your charities. She is honoured by your virtues. She is fed by the bread you have given to the poor." Saint Jerome wrote in the same strain. PAMMACHIUS devoted the rest of his life to study and works of charity. Together with Saint Fabiola, he built at Porto a large hospice to shelter pilgrims coming to Rome, especially the poor and the sick. This was the first institution of its kind, technically called Exendochium in the West, and received the hearty praise of Saint Jerome. PAMMACHIUS and Fabiola spent much time thereat, personally looking after their guests. The site of this building has been discovered and its plan laid bare. In his devotion to the suffering, PAMMACHIUS was following in the footsteps of his dead wife, Paulina, and the blind, the incapacitated, and the moneyless were declared by Saint Jerome to be her heirs. He never went out into the streets, but they flocked around him, knowing well that they would not be turned away. Saint PAMMACHIUS was greatly disturbed by the bitter controversy between Jerome and Rufinus. He wrote to him urging that he should undertake the translation of Origen's De Principiis, and gave Jerome very useful help in his controversial writings. But abate the imprudence of expression of much of them he could not. He also wrote to the people living on his estates in Numidia, urging them to abandon a Donatist schism and return to the church, and this action drew a letter of thanks from St. Augustine of Hippo in 401. PAMMACHIUS had a church in his house on the Coelian hill, consequently called Titulus Pammachii. Its site is now occupied by the Passionist Church of Saints Giovanna et Paolo, beneath which remains of the original house have been found. Saint PAMMACHIUS died in 410, at the time Alaric and the Goths captured Rome. He is often stated to have been a priest, but this does not seem to have been so. There's another saint now, but I need to have a sip of drink, lemon drink. Thank you. Excuse me. The next saint is from the 6th century with no date, and it's spelt Saint RUMON, R-U-M-O-N, or RUAN, R-U-A-N. Before the dissolution of the monasteries, the Benedictine Abbey of Tavistock claimed to possess the relics of Saint RUMON, who in the beginning of the 15th century was referred to by a monk of Glastonbury as a brother of Saint Tudwell, Bishop of Tregua in the 6th century. This RUMON, who gave their names to Walmsley, RUAN, Lanihorn, and other places in Devon and Cornwall, has been believed to be the Saint Ronan venerated in Brittany. Of his life there is likewise nothing known, though there is a story that he had to defend himself from the charge of being a werewolf and carrying off and eating a child. This charge was made by a young woman who feared that the missionary from Ireland, it was said, would make her husband a monk. Ronan's humanness was demonstrated by some wolfhounds which refused to touch him. The arguments against the identification of the British RUMON with the Breton Ronan are very strong. But what does seem certain is that the legend of Ronan was borrowed to do duty for the RUMON across the Channel. Canon Doble adduces reasons for the suggestion that Saint RUMON and Saint Keir, who seems to have been the founder of a monastery or hermitage at Street in Somerset, were native monks of the British Glastonbury who went to make settlements in the Dumonian Peninsula, and the rest of it is too small a font to read. So the next one is very short. It's Saint Fantinus, abbot, from the 10th century. This Fantinus is said to have been abbot of the Greek monastery of Saint Mercury in Calabria. After some years, he claimed that the voice of God was telling him to leave the monastery, and he accordingly did so, wandering about the countryside from place to place, sleeping in the open and living on fruit and herbs. When he came to a church or a monastery, he lamented and prophesied woe. When he met a monk, he wept over him as though he were a dead man. When his friends, much upset by this strange behaviour, tried to induce him to return to the monastery, he only replied that there would soon be no monastery to return to, and that he would die in a foreign land. In due course, the Saracens devastated Calabria. The monastery of St. Mercury was destroyed, and St. FANTINUS, with 2 disciples, went overseas and landed in the Peloponnesus. He lived for a time at Corinth and at Larissa in Thessaly, and then moved to Salonika, where his miracles and virtues made him famous. Here he died. And that's all there is about that saint. And the last one is Blessed Bronislava Virgin, AD 1259. It is related that Blessed Bronislava was a cousin of Saint Hyacinth, and that on the day of his death she saw Our Lady, a vision, receive him into heaven. She joined the Norbertine nuns near Krakow when she was about 25 years old, and for some time led the ordinary life of her order. But her gift of contemplation and consequent love of solitude was so great that she was allowed to withdraw for long periods to a cell in a cave not far from the monastery, and was eventually permitted to live there permanently as a solitary. After her death on January the 18th, 1259, her body was buried in the convent church, and when the buildings were destroyed by warfare, it was lost. But in the 17th century, the relics were discovered again and carried from church to church throughout Poland for the veneration of the people. The cultus of Blessed Bronislava was recognized in 1839, and her feast is observed by the Premonstratensian canons regular. And that's all there is about her, because the rest of it is too small for me to read. Thank you so much for listening. May God bless you and heal you. I'm sending you his peace in abundance, and may you always be happy and joyful in the Lord. God bless the rest of your day, your morning or your evening, whatever time it is where you live. And then I'm going to do one more on Saint John the Baptist, because I wanted to do it before, but I was no time. God bless. Good night. Bye-bye.